Welcome to the Video Professor's Computer Learning Series on CD-ROM. This is the same great lesson that is found on our videotapes. This CD lesson window will always play on top of any application, so you can follow along step by step to learn the program. We have packed this CD with information and sometimes move at a pace that is faster than you'll be able to follow along with. To help you with this, we have designed the CD to work just like a VCR. You can pause, rewind, or fast forward the CD to learn each part just by clicking the appropriate buttons. From the Table of Contents menu, you can select or review any part of this lesson instantly. For your convenience, a Video Professor icon has been added to your desktop. To view this or future lessons, simply put the CD in your drive and click on this icon to start that lesson. Now, to get started, simply click on the menu item you want to learn. For best results, we suggest you start at the first item and work your way through to the end. And welcome to my third lesson on Lotus 123 version 5 for Windows, the popular spreadsheet program that makes home and business accounting jobs a snap. This lesson focuses on the data tools in Lotus 5. In my second lesson on Lotus 123, we learned how to enter and copy formulas that contain relative and absolute cell addresses. We created various charts to graphically convey the information within our spreadsheet. We also added and manipulated various chart elements such as titles and legends. In addition to those skills, we learned how to add worksheet pages and work with fill and copy commands. Finally, we created and printed a summary page containing various charts and spreadsheets. This lesson will build on those skills, plus those in my Learning Lotus 123 version 5.0. So it is important that you know how to do them. If you don't, I suggest you see my tape Learning Lotus 123 version 5.0 and Learning Lotus 123 version 5.0 Level 2. I also assume you have a basic understanding of the DOS and Windows environments for this lesson. And again, if you need a review, see my tapes Getting Started with Your Personal Computer and Learning Windows. In this lesson, we will learn how to create a database and its elements. And as we are doing this, we'll learn how to write formulas that work properly in a database. We'll also see how to sort information within a data table, plus learn how to use Lotus to query for information from one or more data tables. The commands given in this lesson will be a mixture of mouse and keyboard actions and are the ones I believe to be quicker or more appropriate for a given situation. Now, before we start the lesson, I'd like to introduce my student assistant, Suzanne. Just follow along with her and you'll be using the database features of this program in no time at all. Later in this lesson, we'll save our work to disk. Suzanne will save her work to a floppy disk to avoid cluttering up her hard drive. I suggest that you have an empty formatted diskette or the diskette from the first two lessons on hand to save your Video Professor results. Okay, everyone, at this point I'm going to assume you have your computer up and running with the Windows Program Manager open and active on screen. If you haven't done this, stop the tape and do so at this time. Within the Program Manager, open the group window that contains the Lotus 5 application icon. Once the group window is open on screen, double-click on the Lotus 123 application icon. When the Lotus program opens, you may see the Welcome window. Before we begin entering anything into this worksheet, let's do a few things that will ensure everyone has the same tools active and essentially the same screen view. Suzanne, pull down the View menu and select Set View Preferences. Within this dialog box, everyone should have X's in each checkoff box as you see on our screen. You'll remember from my introductory tape that an X in an option box means that option is active. Click in any empty boxes to add that item to our screen view. Also, make sure that Standard appears in the window next to the Worksheet Frame option. And in the Custom Zoom window, make sure that 87% appears in that window. If it doesn't, click on the option arrows until 87% appears here. When you have all these settings correct, click on the OK button. Now open the Tools menu and select Smart Icons. Lotus has a number of pre-made toolbars to choose from. For this lesson, let's select the basic Default Sheet toolbar. If you have something other than Default Sheet selected in this option window, click on the drop-down list arrow, then click on the Default Sheet option. Use the scroll bar if needed. With that done, check the position box on the right side of this dialog box. If Top doesn't appear in this window, use the drop-down list to select this option. One last thing before we leave this dialog box. Make sure the Show Icon Descriptions option in the lower right corner of this dialog box is active. I think that will do it, Suzanne. Click OK to close this dialog box. Now we should all have the same tools and placement of those tools on screen. In my first two lessons, we concentrated on spreadsheets and charts, the 1 and 2 of Lotus 1, 2, 3. And in this lesson, we'll concentrate on the third type of task done in Lotus 1, 2, 3, database operations. Basically, when you have any organized assortment of information associated with a specific topic, you have a database. For example, a telephone book is a simple database that lists names, addresses, and telephone numbers. With a database, you can organize a collection of data, such as alphabetizing the last names in a phone listing. We can then reorganize the list using another aspect of the data, like using the prefix of each person's number. We can also select specific items out of the database. We can do these things and more with a database without re-entering its data over and over. In this lesson, we will build a small personnel database, an employee list, and then we'll create a payroll register to calculate the employee's pay. Both of these will contain employee names in addition to specific information related to each data list.
Professor, I really like using this spreadsheet, but why don't we just use a database program for data work?
We certainly could use Lotus Approach, Borland Paradox, Microsoft Access, or FoxPro to create an employee database. These programs are built specifically to handle large data lists and do it well. However, you may find these database programs are a little more complicated and harder to learn than you need for your database tasks. Lotus 1, 2, 3 is not as sophisticated as these database programs, but it can do basic database tasks such as sorting and selecting records. Plus, this program offers the ease of calculations that are characteristic of a spreadsheet, and the opportunity to convert database results into a chart or graph, which is more difficult to do in a database application. But instead of talking about it, you can see for yourself as we build our personnel and payroll worksheet databases. Any business payroll, whether big or small, can be very complicated due to various deductions, such as state taxes, retirement plans, and other deductions related to the region or type of business. For this lesson, we will keep things simple. We will make several simplifying assumptions and keep the number of deductions down in order to focus on the database skills. You already have a blank worksheet file open on your screen, so let's enter a little spreadsheet documentation in the upper left corner. In cell A1, enter Video Professor Lesson Number 3, Payroll Database. And in cell A2, enter today's date using the @today function. Click on the @ button on the edit line and select Today. Press Enter. Now click on the lower left corner of the status bar to get the numeric format list. Now choose the month, day, year format. In cell C2, enter Personnel in all caps. And while the cell is still selected, click on the Be Smart icon to make it boldface. This will serve as a title for the table for quick identification. Before we go much further, let's save our work to disk. Suzanne, click on the Save icon. It has a picture of an arrow going into a file folder. Because we haven't named this file yet, we are given the Save As dialog box. Now either insert the floppy disk from the first two lessons or a new formatted floppy disk into the appropriate drive. Once done, open the Drives drop-down list and select your floppy drive. To the left of the Drives box is the File Type box. Within it, make sure 1, 2, 3 is displayed as the file type. If it doesn't, open up the drop-down list and select it. Once that is set, click and drag across the generic file in the File Name box and type in VP Data just as you see on screen. That's all that is needed, so click on the OK button to save this file to disk. Many databases are organized in a relational structure which looks like tables with rows and columns of data. Since we have rows and columns in our spreadsheets, it's very easy to adapt that table structure and take advantage of its organizational power. Each column in a data table represents a field, a unit of information, and each row represents a record, all the collected information about one entity in the database. Suzanne, the first data table we'll create is a personnel list. Think about the pieces of information you need to know about any employee: their name, address, phone, social security number, etc. Each of those pieces of information should be a field when you create a data table. Then you can sort data or select records based on the information in the field. Here's how to do it in Lotus. Click in cell A4 to start. The first row in a data table is the list of fields. So enter L name for last name in this cell. I like to type in my field names in capital letters just to make them stand out a little. Arrow over to cell B4 and enter F name for first name. In cell C4, enter rate for rate of pay. One of the rules for field names is that each field must have a unique name. In cell D4, enter status. This will be their tax deduction code, either married or single, with the number of exemptions they claim. In cell E4, enter the abbreviation for department, DEPT. This field headings row is critical to the structure of the data table. Let's format this row to help make it stand out from the data. Select the field names row, the range A4 to E4, and click the right mouse button to get the shortcut menu. Select lines and color, and put an X in the box for an outline. Click OK. I'm sure you can guess what comes next. We'll enter the list of employees in the rows under this. Start in cell A5, the first row immediately under the field names row. Our first employee is Sam Smith, so his information will be the first record in the data table. Enter the last name Smith in cell A5 and enter Sam in the first name column. You can use both upper and lower case letters. It is important that your database entries follow a consistent style from one record to the next to make searching easier and more accurate, and so your reports also look good. Sam's pay rate is $7.50 an hour. That's the third column. And he is married with 3 exemptions. Type M-3 in the status column. Sam is in the administration department, so enter admin in the last column. That's all you have to do, Suzanne. You've entered your first data record. Just type the information in a row, filling in each column. Ready for another? Remember to move your cursor down to the next row. Each row is a record, that is, the information about one employee. The last name is Jones, and the first name is Joan. She earns $10 an hour and is single with 1 exemption, so type S-1. Joan is in the sales department. Now with 2 records, we can begin to see the importance of this structure. I'm sure Joan would not be happy if her pay were mixed up with Sam's, so each row must remain intact. And it wouldn't make any sense to have the pay dollars set into the department column, so we keep the proper information in each column for that particular field. It's really pretty obvious once you look at it. But this structure is a very powerful tool, as we'll see shortly. First, let's add 2 more records just to make it interesting. On the screen now, you can see the data for Ben Miller and Misty Johnson. Enter those records into the table as you see them. Pause or rewind the tape if necessary to complete the task. When everyone is entered, click the Save Smart icon to keep your work. Suzanne, ours is a very small database, but it will serve to show some useful database skills. Databases have a tendency to grow into very large files and tasks that seem very simple with only a few records. However, they can become unmanageable with several hundred or even thousands of rows of data. You can make as many records in a Lotus data table as there are rows on a page, 8,192 rows. However, if your database is that large, it might be better suited to one of the more powerful specialized database programs. Meanwhile, even for smaller data tables, we'll learn how to use a range name to define the whole database without needing to remember the cell addresses. The benefit of using range names will be more clear as we continue to work with the database, Suzanne. But let me set the stage for you. When you do data operations, it's important to include all the rows and all the columns of data, or you may accidentally omit important records or parts of records. Using a range name for the database automatically includes all the rows and columns, so we can't accidentally omit important information. Mark the whole range, including the field names row, Suzanne, from A4 to E8. When you finish, pull down the Range menu and select the Name command. The Name dialog box has a text box at the top where you can type a range name of up to 15 characters. Enter personnel as the name of this database range. Before closing the text box, just notice that at the bottom, the range we selected is filled into the range box. This marked block of cells will be named Personnel, and we can see by the empty central area that there are no existing name ranges in this file. Ignore the Use labels for the Cells section of this dialog box. That's for a different type of range name task that doesn't relate to a database. That's all we need in this dialog box, so click on OK. Now look at the left side of the edit line, Suzanne. There's our range name identifying the area that's still marked on the worksheet. Range names are generally much easier to remember than cell addresses, and even if you forget, you can get a list of assigned range names anytime you want. One thing to remember, however, is that whenever new data is added to a named range, it must be added within the range, for example, by inserting a row, or else the range must be redefined to include the new data.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Professor.
Let's say a new employee is hired, so he needs to be added to the list. If you add the new record in a row below the existing range, it won't be included in the range. So you need to add new records within the range. Here's how. Click on row 8, Suzanne, using the gray row numbered column to select the whole row. Click the right mouse button for the shortcut menu and select Insert. With that done, let's add our new employee, Joe Smith. Enter his last name into cell A8. Then enter his first name in cell B8. Mr. Smith makes $13.50 an hour, so enter that into the pay field. Joe is married and claims 5 exemptions, so enter M-5. And he works in the sales department. With that done, let's check that Joe is included in the personnel range. Click the Range Navigator button just to the left of the @function button on the edit line. There's our personnel range, the only one on the list so far. Click on Personnel, and the whole database is marked, which is now the range A4 to E9. Naming a range is a pretty simple matter. Now, let me show you an example of how a range name can be used. Suzanne, let's search this little database for everyone in the administration department. Of course, with only 5 records, you can figure that out just by looking at the screen. But it would certainly take a little longer if there were 50, wouldn't it? Here's how to search for specific records in a data table. Pull down the Tools menu and select the Database command. In the extended menu, select Find Records. Now we have a dialog box and several new terms to understand. These are important skills, but they may seem unfamiliar at first. Just follow along and don't press Enter or click OK until we've covered all the bases here. Look first at the bottom of the dialog box, Suzanne, where it asks for the database table. Since our personnel list was already highlighted, the correct range is filled in. But if it weren't, you could type in the range name Personnel to identify the table. Now, at the top of this dialog box, we have a set of boxes asking for field, operator, and value. As you specify conditions for field, operator, and value, they are listed in the central criteria area. Criteria is the general name given to the statements describing the records we want to find. For a database, the criteria must be structured to match the structure of the database. That's how the search works. It's possible to mix several criteria in a single search, so this area helps you keep track of the conditions as you build them. We know what a field is, so let's take care of that one first. Click the down arrow in the field box, Suzanne, and select Department.
Professor, how did Lotus know I wanted the admin department?
It didn't. It just displayed the first record entry in the department field. Let's continue to work through the steps here. The second box allows us to define the relationship between criteria by selecting an operator. Click on the down arrow to see the choices. Within this list, we select how the field criteria in this case department, relates to the criteria selected in the value box. For this search, the equal to operator will do the job. So select it if it isn't already selected. The last box in this row asks for a value. When Lotus searches or queries the department field, it will look for the data listed here and measure that data against the relational operator. Click on the down arrow here, Suzanne. We have only two choices listed here because we only entered two department types in this field. Administration is our choice, and since it is already selected, everything is set. This is a very simple search, Suzanne, but let's see how it works before we go on to more complicated criteria. Click on OK. As soon as the dialog box disappears, we can see the two administration department records highlighted. That's pretty easy, isn't it? We can see that the Find Records command compares criteria to the records in the data table and then highlights the records that match. Let's try a little more complicated search and learn how to combine criteria. Pull down the Tools menu, select Database, and Find Records. The conditions for our previous search are cleared, but if you look at the database table at the bottom, you'll see that only the two selected rows are marked. We'll need the whole database, so this is a great time to use our range name. Click in the table text box and type Personnel. Don't press Enter. We need to set some criteria first. Let's search for everyone in the sales department who earns $10 an hour or less. Click the down arrow for the field list and select Department. The equal to operator is okay, but we need to change the value to sales. Click on the down arrow and select Sales.
Professor, I can see the first criteria, but how do I add the earnings?
That's what the two buttons on the right are for, Suzanne. We can add criteria by ANDing or by ORing them together, and we'll get different results depending on which we use. An AND requires that both criteria be matched in order to select the record. An OR will select a record based on either criterion, but doesn't require both. We want to match both the department and the earnings, so click the AND button, Suzanne. Now we need to define the second rule, that earnings are $10 or less. Click on the field row and select Rate. Click on the arrow for operator and select the less than or equal to symbol. That's the arrow that points left followed by an equal sign. And in the value box, select 10. Now we can see both criteria listed with an AND connector. Let's see how it works. Click OK. There they are. Joan and Ben are in the sales department, and their earnings are 10 or less. Suzanne, we've created one little data file and have already seen how the field and record structure helps us select specific information. Now let's combine data from this file into a payroll file and see how to create formulas. We'll put the power of spreadsheet calculations to work with this structured data. I'm sure you remember from the Level 2 lesson how to add a sheet to the file. Let's do that now. Click on the New Sheet button. And let's also give the sheet tabs names to help remember what's on each sheet. Double-click on the B tab and enter Payroll as the sheet name. Now double-click the A tab and enter Personnel. Okay, Suzanne, we're looking at the Personnel table. Which of these fields have information we can use to calculate a payroll? Obviously, the rate will be needed. And we'll need to have their names too. Plus, the status field tells us how to calculate the income tax withholding. In short, we could easily use all this information in the payroll worksheet too. But in database work, it's a good idea to minimize the data redundancy, so...
Whoa, wait a minute, Professor. What's data redundancy?
Oh, okay. Data redundancy is the $10 word for repeating the same information several times in different data tables. A little bit of repetition is expected and even useful. For example, having the employee's name in both the personnel and payroll files. But when you have too many repeats, it's hard to keep everything up to date when something changes, like a person's address. And before long, you have conflicting data in your tables and can't tell which is the correct version. Therefore, a good database plan uses a minimum of redundant fields and relies on linking and joining operations to track changes. For the payroll data table, we'll use the L name, F name, and rate fields. Drag across the range A4 to C4, Suzanne, to select those field names. Now click on the Copy Smart icon. then on the Payroll tab. Once the payroll sheet is on screen, click on cell A4 to mark the position to paste the field names into this page. Then click on the Paste Smart icon. There are two reasons to use copy and paste, Suzanne. For one, it's faster than typing. But even more importantly, this assures that the field names are exactly the same in both places. This will allow you to join information from both tables into queries and reports. Well, the names and the pay rate are a good start for a payroll table. What other information do we need? Well, besides the rate, we should know the amount of hours worked each week. Click on cell D4 and enter HR for hours. And we know that earnings may be calculated as regular or straight time and may also include overtime. So we'll need fields for each of those calculations. Right arrow over to cell E4 and type REG for regular. And in cell F4 enter OT for overtime. In cell G4 we'll add those together to get the total earnings, so enter gross for gross pay. Now besides overtime, we also know that payroll calculations include lots of deductions. We'll only do two, one for the Social Security tax and one for income tax. This is obviously not a complete list, but you can easily add all the other deductions needed when you create your own payroll data file. In cell H4, Suzanne, enter FICA, and in I4, enter FIT. These are common abbreviations for the Social Security and federal income tax deductions. As you press the right arrow to get to the next cell, the window automatically scrolls over. Finally, in cell J4, enter NET for net pay. You know, the much smaller take-home pay you get after the deductions are taken from gross earnings. That should do for the payroll table, Suzanne. You can see from this process that the first step in creating a data table is planning the necessary fields to organize the information in the table. In this one, we'll write formulas to calculate almost all the fields. So we'll really be getting the benefit of spreadsheet power. Now let's quickly put a title above this table to remind users what it's for. In cell B2, enter Payroll Register. A payroll register is the name given to this kind of form where payroll is calculated for each employee on each payday. The nice thing about using a computer spreadsheet and data table is that after it's set up, we can just keep adding to it for each new payday. The three field names we copied from the personnel data table are formatted with an outline. I want to add that formatting to the new fields too. Here's the quick trick. Click on cell C4, the date field. Now click on the Copy Style Smart icon, the one with a paintbrush over a range just to the right of center. The balloon tells us this will copy a range's styles to other ranges. Sounds good. The title bar now advises us to select the cells to format. Drag across the new field names, cells D4 to J4. As soon as you release the mouse button, the selected cells take on the formatting from cell C4. What a nice shortcut, especially when you have a format that involves more than one attribute. Your mouse pointer still looks like a paintbrush symbol, Suzanne. Look at the title bar. It tells you to press the Escape key to turn off the fast formatting feature. Go ahead and do that now, Suzanne. We have defined the fields for this data table, Suzanne, so now it has a structure. We know that many of these fields will be calculated amounts, and we still need to write those formulas. We can do that now without any data in the table, but it may be a little easier to visualize if we have the names of the people being paid. Those names and pay rates are in the personnel data table, so we can simply copy them into this table very quickly. Click on the Personnel tab to switch pages. Now drag across the range A5 to C9 to mark just the names and pay rates. Click the Copy Smart icon, then click the Payroll tab to switch back to the second worksheet. Click in cell A5 to mark the corner of the paste area and click the Paste Smart icon. Now we can see our names, so it's a little easier to think through their pay formulas. Click on the File Save Smart icon to save our work to disk. One of the complications involved in calculating payroll is overtime pay. Generally, any hours in excess of 40 per week must be paid at a premium, usually time and a half rate, We can easily write a formula to multiply the pay rate, but that's only half the problem. We also need some way to decide when the premium should be added. And to help us with that, we'll use the @if function. It's a logical function that evaluates data for a true or false condition and then tells Lotus to calculate accordingly. The @if function follows the same basic structure as the @sum function used in the first two lessons. It begins with the @ sign to indicate a function. Then comes the name of the function, followed by the arguments or variables enclosed in parentheses. The @if function contains 3 arguments, not one range of cells like the sum function. The first is a condition to be tested for true or false. The second is a formula for the true result, and the third is a formula for the false result. The x and y in this function will soon be separate formulas. Suzanne, the logical choice for our first @if function is the first row under the regular pay field, so click inside cell E5. Once the cell is selected, click on the @ button on the edit line and select if from the list of functions. Here is the @if function written out for us with the condition argument highlighted. Remember, the first argument sets up the condition to be evaluated for true or false. For our payroll problem, the condition within the regular payroll field should test whether the hours entered here are more than 40 or not. We write this condition by clicking within the cell where the hours will be recorded, cell D5. Then type a greater than sign. That's shift plus the period key. And finally type in 40. And that's all we need for the condition. The answer to the condition we set will be true if Sam has, say, 42 hours, or false if he has 39 hours. The remaining 2 arguments in the @if function tell Lotus what to do in each case. The second argument is the action taken if the condition is true. Suzanne, drag across the X to select it. We are going to replace this placeholder with a formula. This formula will multiply the pay rate by only 40 hours, the straight time pay. So click on the rate cell, C5, then type an asterisk, the symbol for multiply, and to finish the second argument, type 40. The Y is the third argument, and it represents the action taken if the tested condition is false. That is, if the hours entered into the hours cell is less than or equal to 40. Drag across the Y to select it. For this case, we simply multiply the rate times actual hours, so click on the rate cell, C5, and type an asterisk, and click on the hours cell, D5. That finishes the @if function. Press the Enter key. You should have a 0 in the cell E5 since there are no hours in cell D5 yet. If you have an error indicator, look closely at the function displayed on the screen and edit yours to match the screen view. There should be no spaces anywhere, and the 3 parts should be separated by commas. Pause and rewind the tape to review this section if necessary to make corrections. Now let's test the formula, Suzanne. Click on the hours cell D5 and enter 40. Sam's regular pay is $300. You can verify that with a calculator if you'd like, and that's a good thing to do when you're writing complex formulas. Now enter 45 hours into cell D5. Aha! The regular pay did not exceed the maximum of 40 hours times the pay rate because our @if formula wouldn't let it. Enter 35 hours into cell D5. Good. The regular pay went down to $262.50, which is the correct figure for 35 hours. The @if formula recalculates immediately whenever new data is entered into the hours column, so it's very easy to correct an error simply by typing the correction in the data column.
Professor, what about the times when people work beyond the regular 40 hours? Are we going to pay them overtime?
Sure we are, Suzanne. And we'll use another @if function to make sure overtime pay is paid for only those hours in excess of the regular 40. Before we start writing the function, let's think it through. The condition to be tested is the same whether hours are greater than 40. But this time, if it is true, we will pay only the excess hours. So we must subtract 40 from the hours in D5 and then multiply those hours by the pay rate times 1.5. This gives the time and a half pay premium. And finally, if the condition is false, then there is no overtime pay. That's not too hard when you take it one step at a time. Let's write the function. Click in cell F5, Suzanne. And this time, let's write the function out without using the function button. Type the @ sign. That's Shift and the number 2 key, then type IF and an open parentheses. Now we're ready for the first argument, the condition. Click on D5, then type a greater than sign, and type 40. Good. Type a comma to end this argument. The second argument will calculate the premium pay for overtime hours. Type an open parentheses, then click the hours cell, D5, type a minus sign, and type 40 and a close parentheses. Now type an asterisk and another open parentheses. Click inside the rate cell, C5, type an asterisk, then 1.5. And type a close parentheses. Finish with a comma. The third argument is really easy. Just type a 0 and finish with a closed parentheses for the whole function. Press enter. With 35 in the hours cell, this number should be 0. If you have an error indicator, check that you have no spaces or commas between the three arguments and an equal number of open and closed parentheses. Now let's test the overtime formula. We can see that it correctly did a 0 for less than 40 hours. Enter 45 hours in cell D5, Suzanne. And it works. Regular pay is $300 and the overtime is $56.25. Once again, it's a good idea to check with a calculator to be sure of a complex formula or function, particularly with payroll. People do tend to get upset if their pay is wrong. We can easily copy these formulas down for the other records, but before we do, let's write the remaining formulas for this row. Gross pay, the FICA deduction, and net pay. Then we'll copy everything at once. One point to note, Suzanne, the formulas we wrote here used values all in the same row. This is essential in a data table where each row is a data record. We'll continue to follow this rule with the remaining formulas. Gross pay is the next one in the row. Click in G5, Suzanne, and type a plus sign. This is going to be a simple formula for a change. We just need to add regular pay. Click on E5 and type another plus sign. Then click on cell F5 for overtime pay and press enter when you finish. FICA tax is a percentage of gross pay. In fact, there are two different FICA taxes, and there are also some maximum pay conditions where you could use another @if function. But since we've already seen how that function works, we'll just use a simple formula in our lesson. Click in H5 and start with a plus sign. Now click on the gross pay cell G5 and type an asterisk. The total FICA rate is 7.65%. So type 0.0765 after the asterisk and press enter. The FIT, or federal income tax, comes from a table, so we'll skip that column and move on to the net pay. Net pay is simply gross pay minus all the deductions, so that's the formula we need here. In cell J5, type a plus sign. Then click on cell G5 to start with gross pay, and then a minus sign. Click on H5. Type another minus sign. Then click on cell I5 and press enter. Let's resize the column so we can see more of the worksheet at once. Drag across the column headers from J back to B to select the whole columns. Now position your mouse on any column divider so it turns to a two-sided arrow. Once it does, pull that arrow over to the left to make the columns narrower. Look at the cell address area on the edit line. When it reads 6 characters, release your mouse button. We should also erase the hours in Sam Smith's record. Click in D5 and press the delete key. We use these numbers to test the formulas, but we don't want to create confusion with his real hours, do we? Suzanne, I believe we're ready to copy these formulas down for the other records. Drag across the range E5 to J9 and click the right mouse button for the shortcut menu. and select the Copy Down command. Nice work, Suzanne. Let's save the file before we go on to calculate this payroll. Suzanne, we now have a data table set up with all the necessary formulas to calculate payroll. All that remains is to enter the hours for this pay period and then enter the proper income taxes to be withheld. Employee time cards show the following hours for this pay period. Let's enter those numbers now. Click in cell D5, Suzanne, and enter 39 for Sam Smith. Arrow down to the next record and enter 42 for Jones. Arrow down again and enter 40 for Miller. Arrow again and enter 30 for Joe Smith. Arrow down once more and enter 41 hours for Johnson. Given these earnings, the following income taxes should be entered in column I. 10 for Smith, 51 for Jones, 41 for Miller, 6 for Smith, and 41 for Johnson. That's it. Once the formulas are set up, the actual payroll calculations are done instantly. These numbers come from the federal income tax tables. Of course, you will also have state taxes and other deductions in a real payroll register. You'd simply add the necessary columns and write proper formulas for any additional fields. Now that we have another data table with complete records, let's give this table a range name, like we did with the personnel table, so we can easily do data operations with the payroll information. Drag across the range A4 to J9, Suzanne, to mark the whole table, including the field names. Now pull down the range menu and select the name option. We'll call this table Payroll, so type that into the text box and press Enter to close the dialog box. A quick file save seems in order to keep the record of this payroll. Suzanne, we can add new pay days to this database, just as we added a name to the personnel table. But there's one piece of information missing that will be critical when we add new payday data. We need a field to show the pay date. I think the best place to add that field would be between the hours and the regular pay columns. Click on column E to select the space for a new column to be inserted. Pull down the Edit menu and select Insert. There's a new column. Suzanne, click on the column header and resize the column to 6-character widths. Now click in cell E4 and enter the field name Date. Let's say that the payroll we just did was the first for the year on January 7th. You could simply type the date 1795 into this field. But I want to show you how to use a date function.
Why do I need a date function, Professor? I thought functions were calculations.
You're right, Suzanne. Functions are calculations. The date function translates a given date into a number that can be used in calculations, such as how many days in between these dates. I'm sure you recall the date functions we used in Lesson 2, Suzanne. We may not need to do very many date-related calculations on a payroll file. But if we ever do need it, it's much easier to set up at the beginning than to correct a bunch of records later. The date function we'll use is called @date, and it has 3 arguments: year, month, and day. Now click on the Add button. The date function isn't on the list of common functions, so select the List All option. Click on the down arrow on the category text box and select Calendar. You can see that there is quite a list of functions related to dates. We want to use the simple date function, so click once to mark that choice. Look in the bottom area of the dialog box. It shows the structure of this function and gives a brief explanation. I'm sure you'll find this feature useful to search out other functions, Suzanne. For now, click OK to place this function into the edit line where we can fill in the proper arguments. The year is already selected, so type 95. You'll only need the last 2 digits, at least until the year 2000. Double-click on the month in the edit line and type 01 for January. And double-click on the word day and type 07. Press Enter. In the cell, we are given a 5-digit number. Although it may not look like a date, it does represent a specific date and is used by Lotus in date calculations. Up in the edit line, we can see the complete date function. And the lower left corner of the status bar confirms this is the correct format because it lists automatic as the choice. We'll come back and format these date cells to make them more readable in a few minutes. Right now, let's copy this date code down to the other records for this payroll. Mark the range E5 to E9. Click the right mouse button and select Copy Down. With that done, the other employee records have the proper date codes. Okay, Suzanne, click on the Save Smart icon again to save these new changes to disk. Suzanne, so far we've seen how to create a personnel data table and a payroll data table. We've learned how to use the data find command with a table and how to write some fairly complex formulas that will work accurately in a database framework. Now let's extend those skills one step further by adding a second pay period to the payroll data table. With this step, we can review the process of adding records in a named range. And when we're finished, we'll have enough data in this table to do some interesting queries. We'll add one further twist and change the pay rate for one of our employees. Click the Personnel tab to move back to the first page, Suzanne. Ben Miller has improved his sales skills and earned a raise to $10.50 an hour. So let's give it to him. Click in cell C7 and enter $10.50. We'll copy the names and rates into the payroll table, but this time we'll use a slightly different process since we now have defined a payroll data table. Mark the range A4 to C9. Be sure to include the field names for this process. Pull down the Tools menu, select Database, and then Append Records. This command will add new records to an existing database, appending them to the bottom of the table, and automatically extending the name range to include them. In the Append Records dialog box, the Append From range is the range we've already marked. The To Database Table text box is highlighted for us to type in payroll, the name of the other data table where we want to add this set of records. Once done, click on OK. Click in cell D10 to deselect our highlighted cells. And there you are, Suzanne. The 5 employees are listed and ready to have their next payroll calculated. Notice that Ben Miller's new pay is reflected in this new set of rows, but his old rate shows for the January 7th payroll.
Professor, do I have to write all those formulas and if functions again?
No, Suzanne, we'll just copy them down from the previous rows. Before we do that, let's just work on this new payroll a column at a time until we get to the formulas. The hours for this pay period are displayed on the screen. Enter them now starting at cell D10. 40 hours for Mr. Smith, 40 hours for Mrs. Jones, 43 hours for that hard-working Mr. Miller, 41 hours for Mr. Smith, and 39 hours for Misty Johnson. In the date column, we'll write the @date function for January 14th and then copy it down to this set of records. Click in cell E10. Type the @ sign, DATE, open parentheses, 95, comma, 01, comma, 14, close parentheses. Press enter. Now drag across the range E10 to E14 and click the right mouse button. Then select the Copy Down option. With that done, let's format the date cells. Click and drag from cell E5 to E14. Once that range is selected, click on the status bar and select the month, day, year format. It looks like 12/31/93. Okay, Suzanne, let's copy the rest of the formulas down. First, click and drag to highlight the range F9 to K14. Once done, open up the shortcut menu and select the Copy Down command again. This process automatically copied the same federal withholding in all the new records, so our last step is to enter the correct income tax. Click in cell J10 and enter 12. 46 for Jones, 53 for Miller, 30 for Smith, and 37 for Johnson. And with that, you've completed another payroll, Suzanne. It's fairly simple to add another pay period once the data table and formulas are defined. First, we must append the new records to the established data table. Then enter the new hours and pay rate. After doing that, simply copy the formulas down and enter the correct income tax figures for each person or record. Before we move on, save your file again. We are now ready to look at the sort and query tools. We've seen how to create data tables and append new data. Now it's time to learn how to get information out of the database in a useful form. The reason we use the structure of fields and records is so that data in a database becomes information, organized, selective, and meaningful. The process for pulling information out of a database is called a query, and it is quite literally a process of asking questions in a form that follows the database structure. We saw one example of how this works using the database find records command earlier in this lesson. That was a very simple query. In this section, we'll look at more advanced queries. The query command copies the selected records from the data table into a new space, so you can easily create and print reports that summarize the information from a database. Let's do it, Suzanne, and you'll see what a powerful tool this really is. First, let's create a new page to hold the result of our queries. Click the New Sheet button, and then double-click on Tab C, and enter the title Queries for this new page. With that done, pull down the Tools menu and select Database, and the new query command. This dialog box shows us the 3 steps needed to query information from a data table. Think of a question you would like to ask about the payroll data, Suzanne. Let's start with a simple one. What is the total net pay for the January 14th payroll? And to answer this question, we must provide Lotus with a few answers. Step 1 in this dialog box asks for the database table to query. It should of course be the table that has the information to answer the question. In this case, the payroll table. Since we've range named it, just type payroll in the text box and press Tab to move to the next item. The external button allows us to access information from external database such as Borland Paradox or Microsoft Access. Fortunately for us, our database is right here in Lotus, so we don't need to open an external source. Tab again to move to Step 2. The Set Criteria button works similarly to the Find Records process we used earlier, but the Choose Fields button gives a different sort of control. Let's look at that one first, Suzanne. Click on it. The message at the top of this dialog box advises us that these fields will be included in the query. This means that we can pick and choose which fields will show on the report and leave out those that aren't important. For our first simple query, what is the total net pay for January 14th? Let's leave out all the calculations and just report names and net pay. Look at the buttons on the right side. The Add button is grayed out, while Clear and Clear All are available commands. That means all the fields are currently included in the query until we mark the ones to be left off or cleared.
Professor, when I clear a field, will it disappear from my data table?
No, we're just removing it from the copy of the data records that will be included in the report we are designing. We want to keep the 2 named fields, so arrow down to Rate and click the Clear button. See, it's gone from the list, and now HR is highlighted. This should also be cleared. You can just keep clicking the Clear button until everything is removed from the list but net, as you'll see here on the screen.
Professor, shouldn't we keep the date field since we're asking about the January 14 payroll?
Even if we don't include the date field in this report, it can still be used to select the records we want. But let's add it back to the list just to see how that's done. Click on the Add button, Suzanne. And here's the list of fields we removed from the query list. Arrow down to highlight Date and click OK. There it is, back on the list. We can also manipulate the order that the fields appear in the report. The up-down arrows will move the highlighted fields around in our list. Click on the down arrow, Suzanne. Date moves to the bottom, and that means net will print out first. Click on the up arrow once to put date at the top. These are the only fields we'll need for this query, so click on the OK button. Now we need to set criteria for the report. Click that button, Suzanne. You've seen this dialog box before with the field, operator, and value selections. The and or buttons are for combining criteria. First, we select the field that has the data you want to use for our selection. In this case, it will be date. The equals operator will work okay. No need to change that. And the value that we want is January 14th. That should do for this first query. Click on OK. Back at the step-by-step query dialog box, we're ready for step number 3. Select a location for the new query table. Click on the range icon next to this text box, Suzanne. Then click in cell A3 on the queries page. This will mark the upper left corner of a space for the selected information to be copied from the payroll data table. That takes care of all 3 steps. You've designed a query, so let's see the result. Click OK. Nice work, Suzanne. There's a mini data table with the fields and records you specified. Notice that the menu bar now has Query in place of the range selection. And there's also a set of new buttons on the Smart Icon bar. Pull down the Query menu, Suzanne. Within the drop-down menu, we can see the Set Criteria and Choose Fields commands we just used to set up this query, plus a few more. Right now, I want you to select the Name command. You've seen how handy range names can be. This command allows us to give this query a name, which will save this set of fields and criteria selections. Let's call it January 14 Pay, Suzanne. Don't use any spaces in the query name. When you finish, click on the Rename option. Now look at the Edit line. The query name is displayed as the query range is highlighted. Suzanne, the query selected the data for the January 14 payroll, which is what we asked for. To get a total, we might have written a formula into the query, but for this lesson, let's just write a sum formula below the net pay column. First, click on cell B10, just to leave a little space between the query and this total. Notice that as you move outside the query range, the Smart Icon bar changes back to the usual set. Click on the 1, 2, 3 Sum Smart Icon, Suzanne, and there's the total net pay. The query is a special command of records from the data table. If a record changed in the original table, the query would also change. Yet you can use this data for calculations just as if it were a regular worksheet. It's a pretty simple process and yet a very powerful one. Just follow the steps in the query dialog box to answer any question you have.
Professor, what if some of the information I need for a query is in one table and some is in another?
I can see that you're catching on to this database stuff. That's a good question, and Lotus has an answer. Save the file, Suzanne, and I'll show you. Let's see what possible query we can ask of our 2 tables. What if we ask Lotus to find the gross wages paid to the sales department? Do we have the necessary data fields to query? Let's see. We have a gross pay field in the payroll data table, department field in the personnel data table, plus the last and first name fields. We have the necessary data, so let's do our query. To get the answer to this question, we'll need to join the 2 tables. And in order to join data tables for a query, you must have at least one field that is identical in both tables. Fortunately, we've designed these 2 tables with the same last name and first name fields. And here is a quick overview of the procedure. You first open a query with one data table, then join the second table to that query. Once that is done, you can define the selection criteria and choose which fields will appear in the resulting report. Let's do it. The personnel data table has most of the fields we need, the names and departments, so we'll start the query with that data table. While we're still in the queries page, click in cell A12 to mark the space for a new query. Now pull down the Tools menu and select Database and New Query. The text box for Select Table is already active, so type in Personnel and click OK. This just copied the whole personnel data table as a query, since we didn't specify any fields or criteria. Of course, we don't want all this information, but it did get us into the query mode. Pull down the Query menu, Suzanne, and select the Join command. It is near the bottom of the list. In the Join dialog box, we see our personnel table listed on the left and the payroll table listed on the right. The down arrow on the right-hand side gives a list of all available data tables, so you could choose another if you had more than 2. All the fields are listed below each table. In between the 2 tables is a relational operator that works in the usual way to match fields between them. The equal sign will do the job for us. as we match the L name and F name fields which are already selected. The criteria box at the bottom shows our first join criteria as personnel L, name equals payroll L, name. That works. But just in case we get employees with the same last names, let's also require a match on first names between the data tables. We'll AND together these criteria, so click the AND button, Suzanne. Now click on F name under the personnel list and F name under the payroll list. Our criteria list now requires a match on both L name and F name in order to join records from both tables. That should do the job, so click on OK. The Choose Fields box pops up automatically for the next step. We use this box to tell Lotus which fields to include in the report. Let's keep L name and F name. It can be from either list. Let's keep it from the personnel list. Arrow down to personnel rate and click on the Clear button. Do the same method to clear status. Keep department and clear the next batch down to gross. Leave that and clear the remainder. When we finish, we should have personnel L name, personnel F name, department, and gross on the list. This order looks fine, so we don't need to move anything on the list. Click OK. Scroll down the screen to see the whole list, Suzanne.
I can see that the two tables were combined for this report, but it's everybody. I thought we only wanted the sales department. And why is everybody sorted? How did that happen?
The criteria we just chose set up the join to connect data between our two tables. The sorting happened because we had multiple records on the payroll list that matched the L name and F name fields on the personnel list. Now that the tables are joined, we need to set criteria to select only those records concerning the sales department's gross pay. We saw the criteria command on the menu a moment ago, but there's also a smart icon for selecting criteria. Do you see the three buttons toward the right that each have a question mark? All of those buttons relate to query tasks. Move the mouse pointer over a button to see the balloon description. We want the middle one that says Set Query Criteria. Click on that one, Suzanne. Here's our familiar Set Criteria dialog box. This time we want to use the Department field, so click on the down arrow and select Department. Once done, click on the down arrow for Value and select Sales. That's all we need this time, so click on OK. There's your query, Suzanne. Pull down the Query menu and select Name. Let's call this one Sales Gross Pay. Click on Rename when you finish. Selecting records and designing a report with the query tools is one of the tools you'll use regularly with data tables, Suzanne. There are other tools and methods to sort and query data within Lotus databases. We won't be going through those with you, but you now know enough to explore these other areas without fear. Thanks for being such a good student, Suzanne. Good luck with your database operations, and remember, there's always more you can learn from me, the video professor.